Hello, and welcome to RUSI in London. I'm Melvin, Director of International Security, and welcome to today's webinar, which will be devoted to looking at Russia's invasion of Ukraine 1 year after Russian forces entered the country. On this day in 2022, after a massive buildup of Russian military forces around Ukraine, Moscow launched an unprecedented military assault on the country. Ahead of the attack, President Putin framed his justification for the war in terms of Russia's historical rights to reclaim its lands. Expectations of a quick Russian victory, however, quickly evaporated in the face of heroic Ukrainian defense, first of all around Kiev and then later in Donbass, before Ukraine was able to launch a series of counteroffensives in the autumn, first in Kharkiv and then in Kherson, pushing the Russian forces back across the Dnipro River. Nevertheless, the cost of the war has been huge. Over 100,000 Ukrainian casualties are estimated to have died or been wounded in the fighting. Russia may have suffered up to 200,000. Over 20,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed in the war. There are over 8 million refugees scattered across Europe as a result of Russia's invasion. And the economic cost has been huge, with 1/3 of Ukraine's economy calculated by the IMF to have been destroyed, and tens of billions of euros of investment required to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. After nearly a year of warfare, little movement has taken place in the front line over the last few months, and we seem to be at a point in which both sides are preparing to launch major offensives through the spring and a long period of bloody fighting up to the summer. In this webinar with RUSI experts, we look back over the past year to understand better what caused the war and how the war has been prosecuted, and also look ahead about where the war is going and what the possible ends to the fighting might look like. Today's discussion will be organized as a panel debate in which we'll have about 40 minutes where we will be talking to RUSI experts on these issues, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. At 11 o'clock UK time, we'll pause the discussion for 1 minute to pay tribute to the Ukrainians who've lost their lives in the conflict and who've been suffering, and also to express UK solidarity with Ukraine over the war. But now I'd like to introduce today's panel of RUSI experts. Joining us is Maryna Vorotnyuk, who's an Associate Fellow of RUSI, Ed Arnold, who's a Research Fellow on European Security, and Emily Ferris, who's a Research Fellow covering Russia and Eurasia. So welcome to the webinar. Again, going into the war, there was I think, concern that the Euro-Atlantic community wasn't united and that this would be something that would impede the ability to support Ukraine. We saw some countries who were keen to have a dialogue still with Russia to try and include Russia in the European security frameworks, where other countries were strongly opposed to Russia and thought the only way was to militarily confront Russia over the Ukraine crisis. How do you estimate the unity of the transatlantic community around the war, Ed, and what do you think has been really the driving factor that has brought all of the countries together so effectively?
Yes, and I think Putin was surprised by the level of unity in Europe and the West more broadly. And to be honest, I think people within Europe were also surprised. I mean, in terms of timing, the invasion happened only 6 months after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where you saw a pretty significant split between the US on one hand and some European NATO members on the other. And even then, it seemed to be that strategic autonomy and sort of more efforts by the EU to sort of decouple were potentially had legs, and that's certainly not the case now. And I think in terms of unity, the primary reason is US leadership, partly from President Biden, but also actually a lot of his administration. I think Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been done an incredible job in terms of keeping that unity, doing a lot of traveling and also very clear communication. And actually, when you look at US leadership in terms of support to Ukraine, I mean, it's absolutely enormous. I mean, $27 billion in total. I mean, its 8th defense package that was announced last month was roughly the total of what the UK had provided last year and committed to next year. And these are significant sums of money from the US. And I think that leadership has also emboldened other groupings within Europe, certain separate nations, for example, Poland, a lot of the Baltics, but you're actually starting to see more different leadership groups emerge. I mean, leadership in Europe is not just by one nation. It never has been. It's been groupings. We're seeing far more of those come to the fore now. And then also, I think NATO really is rejuvenated. I mean, NATO has not performed well in the post-Cold War. It's been rudderless in some areas. It's out of operation. Missions have largely failed, especially in Afghanistan and in Libya. And actually what this has done is reorientated it back to where it's really comfortable defense and deterrence. And I think that has gone a long way to keeping this unity, because NATO ultimately understands what it's doing now, where I don't think it has understood its mission in the last couple of decades.
Thanks, Ed. I'd like to welcome everyone who's just joining this RUSI webinar to mark 1 year of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the invasion that started last February. Could I invite those in the audience who have questions to please post them in the Q&A part of the Zoom software package, and we'll try and get to those a little bit later on. But for now, I'd like to just continue with the panel discussion and to begin to look at where we are currently in the conflict. I mean, we've seen, I think, some of the assessments about how Russia, Ukraine, and the Transatlantic community have responded over the last year. But we seem to be entering a new phase in the conflict now. Both Russia and Ukraine have used the winter months to reconstitute their forces. And so coming to you, Emily, first, Russia seems to have started a new offensive in the last few weeks. Is this seen now as a decisive phase, do you think, in the war by Russia, or is Russia aiming to turn this into a long-term protracted conflict and try to wear down both Ukraine and the transatlantic community, do you think?
Well, I think it was clear that Russia was planning this spring offensive for some time, but in terms of whether Russia is digging in for a war of attrition, I think, they have the resources to do that. But I think, judging by some of the things that Putin has been saying in the last few months, he is looking for a way out of the war. Obviously on Russia's terms. Obviously, this is something that at the moment is very unpalatable for Ukraine, given that Crimea is always going to be, from the Russian perspective, off the table. But I think the important thing to note is that Putin is coming under quite a bit of pressure domestically. We've got very important regional elections coming up in September, which is kind of a bellwether for people's sentiment really about the Russian government, and obviously tied to that is progress on the war in Ukraine. And then you've got presidential elections coming up next year. And we can see that Putin is kind of trying to create a bit of an ideology, a bit of a kind of a system that's designed to outlast him. And this is sort of a mishmash of different types of Russian values, a mixture of Orthodox Christianity, and progress on the war in Ukraine is heavily tied to that. So I think Russia does have quite a lot of vested interests in trying to bring about some sort of negotiated end to the war on their terms. So to be honest, I think that the ultimate end of this war is going to not really be decided by battlefield offensives in the next few months. I think it's going to be whether Russia is willing to come to the negotiating table with a serious negotiating stance, unlike the previous ones that we've seen from their perspective.
I mean, what would that serious negotiating stance look like? I mean, we've seen statements by President Putin in his State of the Nation address recently and on Fatherland Day. The goals that he set out at the beginning of the war seem to be exactly the same ones as he's restating now. There doesn't seem to be any movement there. That he's mobilized hundreds of thousands of Russians to fight in Ukraine. The economy seems to be moving on to a war economy. He's cracking down domestically. So where do you see the movement here by Russia possibly being around the war?
Well, I think that's exactly right. What we saw from the State of the Nation address was no real understanding of the concrete goals in Ukraine at the moment. There was nothing new there. We didn't really see, that was a little bit complicated because it was coming after the Biden visit. So Russia kind of hastily had to add in some text that was about the New START treaty. So, Putin clearly felt that he needed to respond in some way, and that obviously cut off relations even more significantly with the US and with the West. I think that what we need to see is, some kind of more serious negotiating panel rather than putting sort of nationalist hardliners leading the negotiations from the Russian side, which is what we've had before. I think that was very difficult because a lot of people knew their sort of revisionist versions of Ukrainian history. So I think if we saw perhaps with China taking not a mediatory role, because I don't think that's something that Russia would accept at all, and internationally in terms of credibility, I don't think that would work either. But what we do see is that whenever Putin has escalated, as we saw in the speech in September when he was talking about nuclear threats in a sort of veiled way, after that we saw that Xi Jinping had a meeting with him and discussed presumably China's concerns. And Russia latterly said that they had listened to China's concerns. And was obviously, I think, Russia's not going to do things that run counter to their own national interest. It's clear that China does have a bit of a role to play in terms of influencing part of the course of the war, because it's framed it as bad for business. And I think that kind of pragmatism is something that Putin well understands. So I think there is still a few doors open, and what that will look like, I think, we'll see in the next few months.
Thanks. Maryna, so from the Ukrainian perspective, they've also been preparing through the winter, and I think many people hope that there will in fact be a military breakthrough by Ukraine in the spring, and perhaps this will change the whole equation that Emily's been talking about here. There's been lots of discussion about Western equipment and what Ukraine needs. What's your sort of estimation now of where Ukraine is in terms of the war and its planning to try to actually achieve a military victory over Russia in Ukraine's Ukrainian territory?
Well, my assessment is that situation on the battlefield is very far from decided. And we see now this attritional warfare with no predetermined outcome, because Russia cannot defeat Ukraine militarily, it seems at the moment, because its war machinery is exhausted. And at the same time, you're asking about the Ukrainian capabilities. I think Ukrainian armed forces still lack the capabilities to liberate the occupied territories. And to tip the balance in its favor, Ukraine would needs not only the capabilities to resist, which is the case now. I mean, it's very often we say that the West supplied the capabilities allowing Ukraine not to fall, to resist, but not to win the war. So I think this is the case now. And then so Ukraine would need, in order to really advance, Ukraine would need the West to put another capability, sort of level upgrade of capabilities, allowing it to degrade Russia's infrastructure and to defeat it. And just to react to what Emily said, I also think it's important to understand. I agree with the assessment that Russia's strategic goals are not changing. So there can be temporary setbacks, but still, I think that, this is very important to understand the predicament that Russia is in, or Kremlin is in, that it started the war that it cannot win. That's why even if we are seeing, some desire to negotiate on Russian side, it does not preclude Russia actually from continuing its offensive. In fact, the first day when the grain deal was signed, you might remember that the facilities next to Odessa port was bombed. So that shows basically that those two instruments, the offensive on the battlefield and actually negotiation, they can continue hand in hand. So they do not exclude one another in Russian strategic thinking.
Thanks. Ed, coming to you, the Western support, as Maryna mentions, had been critical to Ukraine's ability to resist, and we saw it, a sort of unprecedented level of unity at the NATO Madrid summit, at least rhetorically. We're now heading towards the Vilnius summit, where many of the commitments that NATO countries made in Madrid will need to be delivered, but we're also facing the prospect of a longer war. It's possible that, as Maryna was highlighting, Ukrainian forces will break through and make a significant gains. But we saw yesterday UK Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, raising the prospect that we'd still be talking about this war in a year's time. Do you think that NATO can sustain support for Ukraine over the long term if the war does go beyond the summer?
I think they can, but they need to start thinking about that. And, I don't talk about sort of the war's end. I always talk about sort of when the shooting stops at this phase. NATO are going to have to provide a lot of continuing support to enable first deterrence and then defense of Ukraine, potentially for decades to come. So they need to think about that now. So there's two things that NATO need to do. They do need to prioritize the current fight that Ukraine are in, and with 17% of territory held by Russia at the moment, I mean, that suits no one's political objectives. So I agree with Emily that there'll be a negotiated phase, but there's still probably quite a lot of fighting to go first. I mean, Ukraine does have the initiative, it has the options, whereas Russia are running out of options. So I think a lot of this is on timings and actually how Ukraine decides to take back its territory, and we might get into those options later on in the questions. I mean, recently what I've seen of Russian fighting in and around Bakhmut, speaking as a former soldier, I mean, they have not learned a lot of the lessons. I would even hesitate to say some of Russian fighters are even acting like infantry because they are so poorly trained. There's no integral fire support. And I just don't think that while we've seen an uptick in operational tempo from the Russians over the last 3 weeks, I don't think we've seen any output commensurate with that. So I think for NATO at the moment, that is obviously the priority, but this longer term support needs to be very well planned. And if NATO actually can come up with a strategy whereby this long-term support to Ukraine continues, yes, there'll be ammunition natures, which is critical, but actually starting to transition will actually accelerate the transition onto NATO equipment. This is a long-term issue, and it's, you know, so for example, with the fighter jets, I see it less as support to combat operations now. I see it more as transitioning Ukraine's air force onto better equipment so that they can first deter and then defend in the future. And the question of NATO membership might come, but that is again very far in the future, but we need to think that long term ahead.
I mean, how much of this is also going to require actually NATO countries to change? I mean, we've seen a big discussion about things like the lack of capacity on ammunition and munitions to stocks, and big debates about whether NATO countries actually should just give all of their weapons to Ukraine as a way to kind of move things along and not try and hold on to national capabilities. Do you think we're going to see that actually? I mean, as this goes on, we're going to see more and more hollowing out of NATO countries' defense forces as they perhaps send all of their tanks or all of their artillery to Ukraine?
Yeah, and I don't quite, I mean, hollowed out is a term that's bandied around, but I think needs a little bit of definition. I mean, I think when I talk in terms of the support, I call it a NATO investment, because ultimately it is supporting the defense of Europe by helping Ukraine to win the fight and also degrading Russian capability. So I think it's more NATO investing capabilities within Ukraine. And obviously, you know, as this war in the first 12 months, we primarily started giving older sort of Soviet equipment that could be easily used. Then there was this decision for, again, a long-term transformation. So we started to switch them onto higher end weapon systems so that we didn't get the sort of ammunition backlogs that we have seen. But I think a lot of, you know, I think NATO as an organization still has a lot of transformation to do. And I think Vilnius is actually far more critical than Madrid, because there are a lot of very ambitious statements that are still to be refined in terms of defense plans, etc. But I think that they will largely be ready by Vilnius. And then also Finland and Sweden potentially joining the alliance, although we're not entirely sure of the timeframes. I mean, that changes NATO significantly in terms of their own defense plans, but specifically on the equipment support, again, you know, defense industry seems to have woken up now, you know, almost been transformed, that companies are able to make equipment without the orders. You know, Sweden has just said their orders have basically doubled within the last year. You know, ammunition production for 155mm shells in the US has gone up 500% for the next 2 years. I think that demand signal has got through now. There's still a lot to do in terms of specialization and also rationalization, which is something that NATO has talked about for a long, long time, but never actually made that sort of decisive shift. So I'm hopeful that the current situation is that driver to make long-term changes. Of course, it might not be if it's assessed that Russia is conventionally weakened for a certain amount of time, and you'll actually probably see some more of these entrenched views coming back into the fore.
Thanks. So thanks everyone for the questions which are coming in now, I see. And just to mention that if you have a particular interest in the question that's been asked in the Q&A section, then you can upvote that so that it comes to the top of the list, and I'll then prioritize those questions. I think building on what you're saying there, Ed, I wanted to ask the panel a bit about the international dimensions of the conflict, because understanding whether the conflict is going to go on for much longer or not, it's going to depend quite strongly on the ability of both Russia and Ukraine to get support from others. I mean, the war has been framed and understood very much as a European conflict, but perhaps one of the surprising elements has been the degree to which the international community has been pulled in, or there have been efforts to pull in the international community. There's been a feeling perhaps in the West that the global South hasn't supported the West's position on the conflict in the way that was foreseen at the beginning of the war. Russia has looked to actually engage particular countries. So Emily, perhaps I could begin with you on this issue. What has been, you think, Russia's strategy to gain support internationally? And is there actually real support in some parts of the world for Russia in the conflict?
Yeah, I think there is actually. I mean, the way that you framed it's exactly right. I think it's really seen as a European conflict, but I think there's a handy narrative that we say that Russia is diplomatically isolated, because obviously the sanctions are very wide-ranging, and certainly from a Western perspective they are. But it's still clear that there are other countries that are willing to buy Russia's natural resources, to engage with trade in them, even if some of those trade relationships are still a bit nascent. And they're able to kind of ignore some of the more unpalatable aspects of Russia's foreign policy. So we can see that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, has just come back from a trip to Africa. It's his second one in a year. We've got the Russia-Africa summit that's coming up later in the year. That's something that's been held really since 2019, which indicates that, you know, Russia is trying to reorientate a great deal of its trade, plus also its ability to influence those countries politically, and some of its use of private military companies that I'm sure we all know about. But I think that this is part of a long-term strategy of Russia's that's really just been sped up by the Ukraine war. I think this is something that has gained new impetus, new importance. Obviously, you know, the trade with China is going to be really fundamental as to whether Russia is going to be able to find a key market for its natural resources in the next few years. And there's a lot of questions about whether Russia is actually going to be able to do that in a practical sense. But even militarily, right now we've got trilateral exercises between China, India, and South Africa, and these are overlapping with, you know, this kind of 2-year anniversary of the war until the 27th of February, and that was hugely criticised by the international community. And I think there's a real sense that, you know, from some of these countries, that alignment with Russia, whether that's kind of militarily or politically, is kind of an opportunity to overturn this US-led world order idea that I think, you know, in the West, perhaps there is a bit of a lack of understanding about. So I think this was always part of Russia's strategy, which was to, you know, align itself with states in a pragmatic way, that are able to sort of put aside some of their perhaps moral concerns, and they can support Russia in a symbolic way, really, on things like the UN Security Council. I think that doesn't really matter so much. I think it's far more important that Russia is able to call on those new economic relationships.
Yeah, and on that, Ed, I was going to ask you about sort of how the Western community has engaged on this. We saw President Macron at the recent Munich Security Conference saying that the West had not succeeded in engaging the global South, and he made quite a point about this. Do you think that there's been a bit of a surprise in the Western community about how some countries, such as Emily mentioned, South Africa, but we've also seen even NATO allies, such as Turkey, trading actively with Russia throughout the conflict and becoming, if not a supporter of Russia, certainly not looking to oppose Russia in some parts of the conflict. We've also seen recent reports that China may be ready to supply Russia with weapons and ammunition. mean, is it going to be very difficult, do you think, for the West to actually support Ukraine to the point of victory if Russia can rely on all of these different levels of support? And of course, particularly it's been made difficult for sanctions to actually have the bite that I think many people thought they would early on.
Yes, I think Europe sort of were a little bit surprised by that, and it's taken probably quite a long time to realize it as well. I mean, we've known for a long time that Russia is invested in these areas and in its relationships, but we have been a bit slow, and I think there's now more clarity on that. And like you and Emily mentioned, I mean, UN votes, especially the one yesterday with 141 in support, 7 against, which you're not ever going to do anything about, but it's those sort of 32 abstentions which sort of fluctuates but is around that level, which almost gives you those sort of targets. And really, I think it's, you know, on the West, it's not good enough just to talk to some of these countries and talk about democracy, etc. It also has to go with sort of some economic benefits. I think the issue with the global South, I mean, I don't like the term. I find it quite lazy because it's not really regionally focused at all, and it also assumes that, well, you can just message to the global South and that's okay. I think we can't really get away with that. It's going to have to be much more specific. And, you know, Emily already mentioned, I mean, the effort that Russia has put into certain areas, for example, in Africa, diplomatically and also militarily through Wagner, they've been doing it for a long time, and we just haven't really competed in that. So I don't think that we can be surprised. And then the only other point to add is, because the relationship with Russia and Europe is so poor, that they're not going to expend a lot of diplomatic effort, certainly in the short term, in Europe. That gives them a lot of diplomatic spare capacity to actually accelerate what they've been doing. And I think we need to be mindful of that too.
Maryna, I mean, Russia has obviously been advancing its narrative about the war in Asia, Africa, Latin America. There's been some pushback in some of those countries because they've often seen the war through the prism of their relationships to the transatlantic community, but often anti-Americanism has framed that. Do you think there's a role for Ukraine and for Ukrainian agency here to actually sort of engage with some of these countries directly and actually put across the Ukrainian perspective? Has there been any outreach by the Ukrainian government or civil society to these countries in the south on these questions?
Yes, of course, there have been some efforts to engage with Africa, including the visits of the foreign minister, etc. So there has been a quite, ambitious program to try to widen this Ukrainian outreach. But I think there are objective limitations here because Russia simply has, inbuilt advantages here, the positive historical memories with those countries. And I think the advantages that Russia why it managed to claim the support from the countries in this part of the world, because it managed to tell itself as this anti-colonial, anti-imperialist power. And, that its narrative even resonated, that its actions in Ukraine are somehow a result or expected, actually, Russia's reactions to the provocation by the West, to the Western encroachment in Russia's legitimate sphere of influence. So I think, and this is really, I think, sad, and this needs to be addressed by our public diplomacies, the fact that Russia has efficiently managed to obscure the fact that its own policies in Central Europe or Eastern Europe and post-Soviet space are nothing else but colonial and imperialist in themselves. So, simply, as I said, I think Ukraine just simply cannot have that outreach that Russia has at the moment. And the West also cannot match Russian narrative also because of how Russia manages to exploit those colonial traumas. And I think, the discussion that we've seen resurfacing after February reinvasion is that about decolonizing Russia. They are very paramount, and we need to find the way really, to put things straight that, okay, anti-colonial critique is justified, but Russia simply cannot be the champion of anti-colonialism.
Yeah, I think that brings us nicely onto the question I wanted to put to the panel about where Russia is going, and in particular how we should approach Russia in the future. Emily, you mentioned that you thought President Putin was coming under pressure domestically from upcoming elections. I think perhaps some people might be a bit skeptical about whether elections have much impact in Russia these days. But I mean, do you see any prospects for this change that Maryna has been talking about a new generation with a different perspective on the neighbors emerging in Russia, or are we actually facing really a generational confrontation with Russia that's likely to go on, even if Putin is pushed aside or something happens to him, that these ways of thinking are so deeply ingrained in the Russian elite and the Russian psyche that this means that probably we need to frame our future policies beyond the Ukraine war around containment and confrontation with Russia?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think when it comes to impact of elections, I'm not sure I talk about that so much. I mean, we can all talk about how election processes in Russia are not very free and fair. But what they do really show is a bit of a bellwether of how people are feeling. We know that the Kremlin's really interested in Russian public opinion. They do surveys all the time, and a lot of them are closed, so we don't have a great deal of access except when they're leaked in the press. But it's obviously a concern to the Kremlin what people are thinking about the government. So I think we should be concerned about that too. And what a lot of those surveys are showing is not so much whether people are against the war in principle, but what they tend to show is that people are keen to continue the war because now it's started. And it's not so much a question of who started it and who invaded first, but it's a question of how it's going to end. And a lot of the same people that are calling for, the continuation of the war are also the same people that are calling for some kind of negotiation. So there is pressure there. And I think what election processes show is, first of all, turnout. It's whether people are completely disillusioned with election processes to affect some kind of change in Russia. But they also show a bit of a vote of confidence or not in United Russia, which is obviously the ruling party in Russia at the moment. And that is important to the Kremlin. So I think it's something that we also need to be looking at. Now, in terms of the next generation, I think if we're looking at, say, the Russian academic community, a lot of people are silenced due to a lot of the repressive laws. Freedom of expression is very limited. It's very difficult to express really any opposition to the official line. Students have been denouncing lecturers, and a lot of the more, I'd say, liberal-minded academics have left if they're able to, or are very highly restricted from saying anything. So it's very difficult, I think. I think there were lots of hopes at the beginning, perhaps, that anti-war protests in Russia would really have some legs and push, influence the government into changing something. But obviously, that hasn't happened. And I think that is in part because of the very tight control on freedom of assembly and really freedom of expression at all in Russia. But as to whether this has kind of been inculcated to the next generation, the Kremlin is certainly trying. So they've got these new curriculums that they're setting up in schools and universities, and they're really making a push for this kind of Russian revisionist way of looking at the world. And it's not just Russia against the West, really. It's as Russia kind of representing the rest of the world and people who hold the same values as them, to kind of create a bit of a counter narrative for these Western hegemonic values. And I think one of the key narratives that they're really trying to push is that Russia is better off without the West. And they're trying to present the West as a civilization that's in decline versus Russia rising. And they've got lots of performative things like singing the national anthem at schools and raising of the flag. So they're really trying to push this patriotic narrative. And then, really among Russian political society, the government is sort of having a bit of a tussle between hardliners, people like Medvedev on the Security Council, who are kind of providing a bit of a platform for these very anti-Western and really quite extremist views that really didn't used to be that mainstream in Russian politics. The opposition is pretty marginalized. We know that Navalny is in jail. It's very difficult for him to sort of gather people around, rally around the flag, and his regional offices have all been closed. But there are still a few sort of more dovish people within the Kremlin that I think have less influence than they used to. And their role was really to sort of try to advocate for some kind of end to the war on Russia's terms. And what we're really seeing is a bit of pressure between those doves and those hardliners who think actually that Russia's not going far enough in Ukraine and that they should still be pushing for regime change in Kiev and still be pushing into Ukrainian territory. And those people who would prefer, because it's bad for business, because it's bad for Russia's international image, which some people are still concerned about, there is a bit of pressure on Putin to come up with something that is on Russia's terms and that doesn't necessitate a sort of difficult end for Russia on the battlefield. So I think that's what Putin is pushing for now. And what he wants is to shore up his legacy so that the way that he's remembered in years to come and how history will be written, because we know history is very important to Putin, is that he is a bringer of peace and not a bringer of war. And so what we're really seeing with a lot of the Kremlin narratives is trying to promote Putin as the person that is pushing for negotiations, pushing the West, and the West as this sort of warmongering, basket of conspiracies that is controlling Zelensky himself and controlling the Ukraine war. So I think that's the position that Russia is now taking. Obviously, we can take that with an enormous pinch of salt about the sincerity of it. But what I think is quite sincere is Putin's image. And I think he is investing a great deal in ensuring that that carries over to the next generation.
Maryna, how would you sort of say that Ukraine views what's happening in Russia? Is the assessment that there are possibilities of change that would bring a different kind of leadership, or perhaps a more positive leadership, to power in Russia, or is the only way through military defeating the Russian forces in Ukraine?
Well, I would say that the prevalent feeling in Ukraine is that there is no much space in Russia for some profound political transformation that would allow, for some new paradigm in the Russian-Ukrainian relationship at the moment, or for Russia to actually stop the war. So, and talking about the Western engagement, I think, about the part of the question, whether we need to assume that relationship with Russia are not going to, recover or change for better very soon. I think, we need to operate with assumptions that at the moment, these relations are irreparable and for the near or medium term, and that Russia continues or will continue to pose a profound military threat to Ukraine and to the West. And I think that for a better scenario to materialize, when West manages to insulate itself from this detrimental effect, of Russian malign actions, actually very important shortcomings need to be remedied. Invest in how West approaches the war, and Russia in particular. And I think, I agree with the assessment that the Western response has been remarkable, and this shift has been really very significant shift from the position when we don't supply lots of weapons to Ukraine in order not to provoke Russia, to where we actually are today, when the large-scale, massive military assistance to Ukraine is already the case. But this took time, this took preventable human losses, and for those self-imposed red lines to be crossed. And I think one of the problem, and I'm wondering whether Russia's policies would have been the same hadn't those red lines been advertised so openly about where the boundaries of West engagement in Ukraine are, or what West won't be doing in Ukraine. And I think one of the shortcomings also is that I don't see really a unified vision about what Russia's defeat is. Because it's popular to be saying that Russia needs to be defeated, Ukraine needs to win. But I don't really see the discussion about where are the limits, what are we actually striving for in our actions vis-a-vis Russia. And I think that, I saw this oversensitivity in the West, to really make Kremlin aware that, those boundaries are, and significant asymmetry. I also would say asymmetry of attention between actually what Ukraine needs to do to stop the war, what West needs to do not to achieve this, not to allow for this escalation, and much less attention to the fact actually how to compel Russia or how to push Russia towards what is in our security interests, how to compel Russia to stop the war. So I think this asymmetry has to be, much corrected.
Ed, perhaps I could ask you then on that very point that Maryna has brought up there, which is the consensus in the West has been built largely around the idea that I think President Biden just expressed when he was in Ukraine recently, was that Ukraine shouldn't be defeated. But others, I think, in the Western camp have said, well, but Russia should be defeated. That's the main way forward. So there seems to be a sort of a playing with words to ensure that the consensus goes forward here, which is often masking what I think what Maryna rightly highlighted is a lack of consensus about what the end of the war will look like and what we should do in terms of constructing policy towards Russia in the future. Do you think that's going to be a problem for this unity that has been constructed by the transatlantic community around the war?
Well, I think precisely because of the reason that there is a lack of consensus, and also the fact that there are multiple pathways to how this war ends, there's still multiple escalation points. But I think actually what the West and what the US in particular is trying to do is just sort of take it more incrementally. And I think we've seen that with weapon supply to Ukraine. So I think they're actually, because this is so complicated and we don't know where this is going to end, the chosen approach is to almost look at it as sort of, fighting seasons. So campaigning. So we're now, we've seen what happened in 2022. We're now on 2023, and they will sort of try and adapt the strategy to whatever happens on the ground. And then, depending on what happens towards the end of this fighting season, we'll sort of rejig to sort of 2024. And I think you've seen that probably starkly in terms of Europe last month in January. I mean, there was a significant uptick. First, the Tallinn Pledge with the UK or the Joint Expeditionary Force and Central Eastern European members on the 19th. And then you had the Defence Contact Group at Ramstein on the 20th. And then the week after that, then you had the tank pledge, specifically from Germany to also remove exports, which had been talked about for almost a year at that time. Because I think at the moment, the European and Western powers think that Ukraine have got a chance. So it's about providing them the ability to get to a point militarily whereby this can move to sort of a political negotiation stage. But again, that is not a predetermined path, and a lot of it actually will rest on what happens in the next couple of months. And also the fact that, again, on tanks, that the West made, a very delayed decision on it. I think that decision should have been made in October last year, where the tanks would then be ready for how Ukraine wants to use them right now. So it's actually it is also putting a lot of pressure on Ukraine, and particularly their defense planners, this approach, because it doesn't actually provide them the certainty with what they've got, which if they had that certainty, they could plan better and then also execute that plan better on the ground.
Okay, I think at this moment I'll start to take some questions from the audience, and I was going to begin actually with a question by Jacob Yonaby, who asks, I think this issue which has often run through discussions about the nature of the war. So in my opening remarks, I referred to President Putin's comments where he made a series of speeches ahead of the war, where he framed the war in sort of historical terms, Russian imperial terms, about reclaiming historical lands, the destiny of Russia to control this space. But others have highlighted that Russia was actually perceived a threat from NATO, and that this was one of the main triggers. And of course, famously, the US international relations theorist John Mersheimer has, I think, put a lot of credibility in this idea that the NATO threat has been the trigger here. Jacob asks, is this a smokescreen, this issue of NATO's threat to Russia, or is it something that was taken seriously by the Russians? Emily, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. I mean, I think it was a lot of different things. I think that there was obviously this perhaps a lack of understanding within Russia about what a closer relationship between Ukraine and NATO could look like. I think there has been concerns really since 2014, of course, since Russia annexed Crimea and with the association agreement with the EU that Ukraine signed. I think there was a real genuine concern by Russia that Ukraine would be moving more closely towards Western security structures. And of course, the way that Russia interprets the EU is as a security structure rather than as an economic one. So I think that needs to be factored into it. And then, Russia has for years really been talking about, its perceived concerns about NATO infrastructure moving more closely to Russian borders. obviously, I think it's not quite clear what can, in the Russian sense, what constitutes this kind of infrastructure, what is of a concern and what isn't. You know, given that the advent of some Scandinavian countries to NATO prompted a rather different response from Russia, which was to wait and see how that played out. It wasn't so much that that was an immediate security concern that required a huge amount of military mobilization in the north. So I think that Russia sees Ukraine very differently to other countries that are joining NATO. So Ukraine and Belarus, given their historic, cultural, linguistic ties, the way that Russia sees this is really as an inextricable part of Russian territory, and as something that, for it to move closer to any kind of European security structures or otherwise, is a serious threat in itself. And then I think there was the added concern about discussions of Crimea that started to resurge in Ukraine in 2021, and Zelensky was talking again about this Crimea platform, and there was a bit of a discussion about returning Crimea to Ukraine since 2014, and I think Russia started to consider that to be a potential threat as well. So we can all I think there's a lot of discussions about how we got here, but certainly the disenchantment between the West and Russia is something that has been brewing for a really long time. The Russian position is, of course, that Russia is not respected and not understood, and that there is no interest from the Western side in trying to understand that position. And I think, an isolated Russia and one that we don't understand is a very dangerous Russia. And I think it should be, a real cause for concern. And Neil, going back to your question earlier about whether this is, we're digging in for the long term here with our relationship with Russia. This has been coming for a long time, but I'm not sure that we've massively advanced our understanding of Russia since the war started.
Maryna, perhaps I'll give you a chance also to respond to this question.
Well, my feeling is that Russia's concern about NATO's expansion has been really genuine, but not necessarily because of real perception that NATO's expansion poses the threat to Russian interests militarily, but rather, I think, because it would mean the automatic shrinking of Russia's sphere of privileged interests. And so this is obviously perceived in Kremlin with this all, thinking about post-Soviet space as something which is exclusively or should be exclusively Russian, gravitated towards Russia, or the best, being in this Russian sphere interest. So of course, then that was perceived as a threat. And because NATO's expansion, of course, would cripple this whole idea of Russia as a great power, especially Ukraine's and Georgia's accession to NATO. So, and that's why I see this war as part, to preempt this happening, but also to preempt. I mean, one of the approaches that I partially agree with is when, the colleagues, the experts say that Russia also preempted Ukraine from growing as their regional leader, because becoming a centerpiece of the regional security architecture. So, and this was clearly a preemptive. And also, from point of view of domestic politics in Russia, I think confronting NATO has been a very, very important instrument for Putin to consolidate his power, rallying under the flag effect. So NATO, this issue has been important, and the problem is, I really see this as a problem we need, to plan the contingencies, policies around. Is that Russia is really, Kremlin is a hostage of its approach now at the moment. Starting the war, it cannot win. So that means that it's we need to think about the ways, of course, which would not include face saving or off ramps to Russia, but that would, in my opinion, that would leads us to the only conclusion that we need to deliver strategic defeat to Russia to actually to stop what is happening.
Thanks very much. We're coming up on 11 o'clock, where we're going to pause our discussions just to have 1 minute silence to mark the war. But I think we can perhaps get one more question in before then. And I'd like to direct this to Ed. So Jonathan Swithenbank, he asks, which Western capability that has been provided to Ukraine has provided the most important sort of impact, the positive outcomes for Ukraine? So we've seen things like HIMARS, we've seen the Turkish drones at the beginning of the war, the UK providing these NLAWs. Has there been one kind of outstanding capability, or perhaps one that's in the pipeline, you think, that's likely to make a big difference in the conflict?
I mean, I don't like saying that sort of there's silver bullets to any of this. And actually what Ukraine shows is that you need a variety of capabilities to achieve your offensive and defensive objectives. So I think that's a point to be made, but it has to be HIMARS, and specifically the range, the accuracy and precision that provided. It meant that the Ukrainians were able to target Russian rear cause, didn't cause logistics issues because Russia had them anyway, it just compounded them. So they were able to suddenly target C2 and the command and control and logistics, and that just compounded Russian problems. And it also meant the Russian artillery, they didn't need to target the guns, they targeted the ammunition, which was stocked up in central locations. So again, they negated probably Russia's main offensive prowess, which is the very heavy use of artillery. It was instrumental in Kherson, certainly, not less so in the Donbass in the east, which was more of a conventional fight. And in terms of further capabilities, I mean, there are missiles that you can fire from HIMARS that even extend that range further. The US have been reluctant to provide them now because it would mean that Ukraine could fire them deep into Russian territory, but providing that range would then force Russian logistics further and further and further back, compound the problems, and actually would enable them to win. The weakness of them is the ammunition consumption is very high, and the US does not want to provide all of this ammunition because they need to keep them. It's from live stocks now, so that's sort of the risk here as well.
I mean, the challenge at the moment seems to be not particular systems, but making them all work together to do what's called this combined arms operation. This is what Ukraine is going to have to do to try and break through the Russian lines in the next few months. Do you think that Ukraine is ready for this kind of warfare?
Yes, and I think we just look at the counteroffensive in the east in September. It was an intelligence-led operation. It was well planned, it was well executed, well exploited. I don't think that they realized how good it would be. And also they didn't get overextend. Commanders always get eager when they're offensive, and they managed to prevent that from happening and went as far as they needed to achieve their political objectives. But I'll stop there now just for the silence.
Thanks very much. And at that moment, I think we'll pause our discussions just for 1 minute of silence, just to remember all the people in Ukraine who've suffered as a result of the war. Welcome back to this webinar that RUSI is conducting today to mark 1 year of Russia's war against Ukraine. I'd like to continue now with some of the questions that we've been getting in the Q&A from the audience. Tom Redfern brings up, I think, an important issue about the role of, well, he talks about social media, but I think it's kind of the wider information warfare campaign that's been underway, where many people feel that Ukraine has had a major success here, an outstanding performance. Perhaps I could ask the panel how they rate the importance of information warfare in this conflict in terms of shaping perceptions, building support. And perhaps I could bring in with you, Maryna, since the Ukrainians seem to have been masters of this particular art of warfare.
Yes, very important question. I think this war has been very widely covered and reported in the social media, with lots of important footage coming online as we speak. And I guess it helps also to document and to register the cases and what is happening there, and create the public opinion in the Western societies as well. So on the other hand, social media can be used as for the purposes of actually showing what Russia is doing, or Russian atrocities on the battlefield. But at the same time, Russia can use the same medium, to try to promote its narrative. And I think that we can fairly say that Western societies developed some sort of a degree of immunity towards Russian narratives, or helping to debunk those myths and information that Russia has been promoting. But at the same time, we've discussed already that in some parts of the world this is not the case. Those narratives, they spread easily. And of course, this means that I think this is likely to be just another dimension of this warfare, because of course this warfare is conducted at many different levels, and social media, I believe, is just one of them.
Emily, it's the same question. I think going into the war, that there'd been a feeling that Russia had been leading on information warfare. There'd been all of this effort to counter disinformation in the EU and by the United States. But actually, Russia doesn't seem to have been so successful, at least around the immediate countries that are linked to the war. Maryna brings up more widely in the world the question about the narratives. How successful do you think Russia has been in terms of using these kind of tools around the Ukraine war?
Well, I think for Russia, the social media aspect, I think, is probably not the most important. We've all seen these things about military bloggers that are criticizing the Kremlin from time to time. But I think what's kind of important is the way that the Kremlin has kind of adapted some of its messaging and has belatedly, admittedly, kind of realized that it can't be this black box of information and to not say anything to the public. So what we've seen is the Kremlin setting up things like the Coordination Council, which is headed by Prime Minister Mishustin, and the the State Council, which includes a lot of the regional governors as well. And what they're doing is try to mobilize the home front of the war. So that's getting businesses involved with supplying the front, moving the whole economy really onto a semi-war footing. And that is trying to move some of the messaging on the war away from the Ministry of Defense, which I think the view within the Kremlin was that the messaging hadn't been very well handled and not very well communicated to people, especially around mobilization, when, of course, we saw a lot of those protests across Russia in response. And then I think the way that the Ministry of Defense has started to recognize some of the military casualties in the war is kind of important. Instead of doing what they did in previous wars, so in Chechnya, there was a really sort of blanket of information about the war. Nobody was talking about any military casualties at the time. But now they are releasing, of course, very heavily doctored figures, but they are acknowledging that people need something to work with. And they are not sort of denying the loss of soldiers in the same way that they used to. Now, of course, the way that they're phrasing the war is the special military operation, refusing to call it a war. All of those things are, feed into the way that they are framing the conflict as not a sort of an active war. But they are, I think, learning from the public's response. And the way that Putin had a meeting with the soldiers' mothers' committees in November last year. Obviously, this was, they're an NGO that in previous years they'd been advocating for their sons' rights during warfare and in peacetime. And this very kind of choreographed event was supposed to, it was handpicked really for nationalist groups and wasn't really the core of, opposition movements or anything like that. It was very closely controlled. But I think the overall messaging was kind of interesting, which was that Putin was suggesting that he was listening to mothers' concerns. So even though it didn't really present an opportunity to challenge him on the war, what it did show was at least staged, hard to believe how truly he believes this, but it was a sort of sign that he was showing that he was listening to the public's concerns about the loss of life in the war. So I think the Kremlin's messaging on this has started to adapt to public opinion and trying to listen to them a little bit more.
Thanks. Then I want to perhaps put together a couple of questions that have come in, I think, and that they really refer to the issue of escalation of the conflict. We've got Jim Dingerman, who asked about this, the recent reports about how credible is it that China will supply Russia with weapons and ammunition? Is there any specific evidence about that? There was another question about whether there's a risk that Russia may escalate the war into different countries, such as in Central Asia or South Caucasus, maybe Belarus. And there's been a third one from Fabian Lucas Romero, who asks whether sort of fears about escalation have actually limited the West's interests and enthusiasm for actually supplying Ukraine with the weapons that it needs. Ed, how do you sort of approach this issue of escalation around the conflict? Do you think that there is a risk that the longer this goes on, other countries may get pulled in, and we risk that the Ukraine conflict becomes something much wider, perhaps even leading ultimately to a Russia-NATO clash?
The risk of escalation is always there. I mean, the reasons to be optimistic, like I said in an earlier answer, I mean, managing escalation and deterrence is really NATO's core task, and they have a lot of experience in doing so. So it's something that happens all the time, and it happened prior to the current sort of war. I do agree that I think it's Russia's use of sort of the threat of a nuclear instrument has been able to coerce some members of the Western alliance in almost self-deterrence in terms of what they supply to Ukraine and when. That's very clear over the German position on making sure that the US send M1 tanks before they released their own Leopards, and also the export licenses for others to do so. There is also, again, the risk that it will escalate in other countries, and the longer this drags on, it is likely that other countries will sort of start to get sucked in either directly or indirectly. And we have seen that. I mean, again, with Iranian supply of drones to Russia, it is starting to suck people in first regionally and then perhaps globally. I mean, on China specifically, that would be probably a significant escalation. And in terms of the evidence, I mean, the US have said it a couple of times now, and they may go down the route of preempting any such decision by exposing that via intelligence dissemination as one potential avenue. And it does come at a time when US-China relations have gone through a little bit of a rough patch in the last couple of weeks. But like I said, that would be a significant escalation of the conflict.
Emily, how far do you think Russia is willing to go in escalating the conflict? We've seen this language around nuclear weapons that seems to have diminished in recent months, and reportedly China has put some pressure on Russia around this, and we've seen that actually just today in the Chinese draft sort of peace proposal that they've released, that they've made quite a strong statement about avoiding nuclear conflict. But is Russia prepared to actually take the conflict into other places? There's been a lot of focus about pulling Belarus, for example, into the conflict, or other countries.
I mean, personally, I don't think so. I mean, Belarus and Russia are very tightly aligned in terms of security and politics as part of the Union State framework that they're trying to push now for much more deeper integration. So I think there's been concerns from the beginning that Belarus will become a much more active aggressor rather than a co-aggressor, in the sense that they were acting as a launch pad for the offensive on Kiev in the north. But I think there's a great deal of unwillingness within Belarus to do that. Certainly a lot of the public opinion polls that have come out have suggested there is no real public appetite for Belarus to be involved. Its armed forces offer, frankly, very little in terms of support for Russia. What they do offer is a bit of logistical support that Russia could do with, but Belarus is pretty much already supplying that in terms of medical support, in terms of using its railway infrastructure as they used in the beginning of the war, and they are so closely aligned in terms of security, and of course in terms of the international perception of the two of them as now kind of interchangeable in the sense of their views of the world, that I don't think that there is a material benefit for Belarus to be pulled more closely into the war. Now, if there's a question about whether Russia is interested in territorially taking over other states, I don't think so. I don't think Russia, first of all, has particularly the ability to do that, because geographically that's extremely challenging. But Russia has plenty of other so-called levers of influence at its disposal, in places like Moldova, as we've seen in the last few weeks, and in the Baltic states, there is still quite a heavy Russian influence over some, businesses, economics, and I think, I don't see any real interest in Russia in. People have talked about whether Russia's interested in restoring the Soviet Union and, going back to those imperial days. I certainly don't really hold that view at all. Belarus and Ukraine are, I think, in the Russian mindset, particularly significant in terms of their historical ties. But other countries, such as, whether the idea that Russia would take chunks out of northern Kazakhstan, I don't think is a practical or a political reality for Russia.
Okay, then putting together some other questions, I think, which are really around the idea of deterrence. Well, Jamie Leach asked a very simple question: how will the war end? But perhaps linked to that, I think, is Alex Wolchester's question about sort of post-war scenarios. And I think that there's been a few questions really about how can Ukraine and its allies build a security for Ukraine after the conflict comes to an end, or as Ed put it, as the fighting stops. What might that look like? I think this links into another question that someone's asked in the Q&A about whether NATO membership for Ukraine is realistic and should be a priority. Maryna, so perhaps I could come to you on this question to begin with. What do you think is going to be the best way to protect Ukraine from this kind of thing happening in the future?
Yeah, very complex set of questions, from how the war will end to actually how to achieve, the better scenarios for Ukraine. Well, Kiev's position is that, there is the idea of Kiev Security Compact, basically Ukraine's allies multilaterally, but also bilaterally providing security guarantees to Ukraine. So helping Ukraine defend itself. So boosting, cooperation, military cooperation with Ukraine, providing weapons, trainings, joint exercises, etc., etc. So something which the contours of this we are already seeing happening, but Ukraine wants to have it like an overwhelming, compact, the legal framework for that, or Ukrainian peace formula, that seems to be accepted by many Ukrainian allies as a viable path to sustainable peace after the war is over. And of course, Ukraine's position is that it needs to become a NATO member. It remains unchanged, and we see really the Ukrainian population very strongly mobilized behind the idea, which was not the case before the reinvasion. There was a solid support there, probably which might have been overlooked by Western academia and expert communities, that it has been steadily rising after 2014. But now, after the reinvasion last year, we've seen really very high levels of support for NATO membership in Ukraine. So yes, basically, completely the vision of Ukraine's vision for the future is Ukraine, anchored in the Western security structures, aligned with the West, and completely decoupled from Russia. So I think this decoupling is something that we've already seen, and it's irreversible. The question about the end of the war and how the war will end, and the escalation that we've discussed before, I think, fortunately, I don't think that the most dramatic scenario is likely, that Russia will be able to advance, significantly in Ukraine, like trying to capture Kyiv. But it might, try as a minimum to consolidate its grip on Donbass in its administrative borders. So the Donbass it controlled pre-February 24, and to those pieces that so to basically to have Donbass in its administrative borders. So this could be one of the plans, let's say, that Russia, in the worst case scenario for Russia, can content itself with. And probably just to comment also about the risks that Russia might be trying to expand those or to escalate in Moldova or elsewhere. I agree with the assessment that I think that with it being bogged down in Ukraine, it's a very cautious forecast, but that it's not in its interest, and it doesn't simply have the capabilities at the moment for that. Redeploying its forces from Abkhazia, South Ossetia, or from Syria to Ukraine, I think it's really being bogged down there for an indefinite amount of time. I'll stop here.
Ed, what do you think the West is willing to do in terms of providing Ukraine security in the future?
I think it's part of a process, and ultimately, like I said earlier, at some point the shooting will stop. If it goes well for Ukraine this year, then it might be this year, probably next year, and then there'll be a period of discussions, negotiations, which will start to happen. But the four sort of major steps, I think, is first deterrence. So that's the first step, that Ukraine needs to re-establish deterrence, and that's deterrence by denial. So ultimately make the costs of a further Russian incursion, say in 3-5 years time, just out of the cards, just because of what they'll lose. And I think, looking at it from a military perspective, Ukraine is going to be a significant fighting force like it wasn't necessarily 12 months ago. So I think that will re-establish deterrence. Then the next stage, almost hand in hand, goes with defense. Ukraine, the ability to defend their country and probably defend every inch from a further incursion. The issue with the next step would be security guarantees. Now, there's a bit of a risk here, because if the security guarantees provided by Ukraine are ambitious, as there will probably be a bit of political pressure to do, then it could actually pull in NATO to a wider conflict in the future. So there'll be a lot of hesitancy around the security guarantees that are provided to Ukraine. And then the last stage would be NATO membership. So there'd be probably some form of security guarantees in the period before potential Ukrainian NATO membership, similarly of what we've seen provided to Finland and Sweden. And there'll be real issues with the question of NATO membership, and I think NATO will have to take a position in Vilnius, because I agree with Maryna's point that there's a lot of support for membership within Ukraine, but also actually I think in the European electorate levels of support, and they're not burdened by the decisions of policy making. So there'll be a lot of public support within a lot of NATO capitals to sort of push this question slightly forward. And then I think also, Ukraine's going to be a significant fighting force in the future regionally. It's going to be one of the largest. It already is one of the largest, has very good equipment, but more significantly, they have the experience of fighting Russians, which no other NATO member has. And that's pretty significant when you're sort of weighing up the costs and benefits of Ukrainian membership.
Just let's come back to the sort of your last point about NATO membership, Ed. You mentioned there's a lot of support in Europe for this, but presumably ultimately this is going to be a question for Washington, because NATO membership involves the extension of the US nuclear umbrella primarily, as underpinning the whole spectrum of deterrence. President Biden and his advisors have been very careful, and you've spoken about this on the escalation, to ensure that Russia understands that NATO is not coming into direct contact with Russia in the conflict. But NATO membership would put NATO directly on Russia's border, right in what Putin has claimed are important sort of security priorities for the country. So is there any appetite in the US, do you think, to actually extend NATO that far into Eurasia?
I mean, perhaps, but I think, I also agree with Macron's recent assessment that we're talking potentially decades in the future. So I think what Washington is primarily looking at is sort of what, the Russia in the future, and whether so I think that question will perhaps come up, but they'll have to have a position on it. And I think NATO will have to have a position on it this year and say something more than it did in 2008. I think there will be a lot of, like I said, within the electorate, levels of support for it, and policymakers will have to almost sort of rationalize the decision, whatever that is. But also, I think it's not necessarily just the question of Ukrainian NATO membership. I think where we are now, partly with the war and partly through other issues, is actually the post-Second World War European security order architecture, whatever you talk about it, is actually fraying around the edges. It's not just within terms of NATO, OSCE as well, and all of these either treaties, initiatives, agreements, that they're all sort of written for a Cold War world. And I think it's really important that we take this opportunity as well to sort of rationalize and modernize the architecture when there's potentially an ability to do so, and not just have it regress to, well, Russia is the adversary, so we have to go back to more of a sort of Cold War footing. So I think this is one part of a larger architecture again happening over the next potentially couple of decades.
Perhaps linked to that, and the most popular question in the Q&A concerns this issue of Sweden and Finland membership, and in particular Turkey's blocking of that. So Roger Higginson asks about this issue. Does this suggest that, is this going to be resolved, do you think, Ed, that Turkey is going to actually remove its block? Or perhaps, I know, Maryna, also you follow issues in Turkey very closely. Perhaps either of you could come in on this. So do you think that Sweden and Finland will be able to join NATO, or will Turkey likely continue to leverage this? Or is there some bigger deal to be done, perhaps involving the US and its relationship with Turkey? So perhaps, Maryna, do you want to take that first?
Yes. Yes, happy to. So for Turkey, this kind of obstructionist position towards Sweden's and Finland's membership in NATO, accession to NATO, it serves like a bargaining chip. So it's a part of the wider Turkey-West relationship. So of course, it might be playing now in Russia's hands, because Turkey and Russia are their strategic partners. But I think this obstructionism or this will be removed, after Turkey gets sufficient level of support on, the political support, or dividends, let's say, from those negotiations and from pressing. And also we should keep in mind that in May there are elections, parliamentary and presidential elections in Turkey. So this is also a part of this. Turkey has been doing poorly recently in economic terms with hyperinflation, and just recently this tragic earthquake. So, and I think this position of Erdogan, again, trying to capitalize on the strong hand, image that he built for himself within the country. But on the other hand, Turkey's position is very peculiar, because on one hand, we've seen it balancing between West and Russia. So this all obstructionist position can be read in the light of Turkey to some sort gravitating towards Russia and try not to, to have a significant or considerable presence of external powers, non-littoral states in the Black Sea, which has been always the Turkey's position here in the region. This is where Turkey and Russia has been very much on the same page, and and tries to preserve this Turkish-Russian condominium. On the other hand, let us remember that still, despite those rifts, and those fractions, in the relationship between Turkey and the West, Turkey still. Turkey's strategic interests are in the West and in NATO. That's why I'm more or less optimistic about thinking about the future. What kind of decision Ankara will be taking in this regard. Because yes, it contributes to NATO's defense and deterrence posture. So, and is going to continue to do so. Probably yes, not confronting Russia so directly as other allies would do. So trying to have this equidistant sort of relationship, but still with a more solid tilt or tilting towards NATO and its allies in NATO.
Hey, did you want to add anything to that?
I won't add much because I think Maryna did a very good job of answering the question from a Turkey perspective. So just from a sort of NATO perspective, like I said, I mean, Vilnius, a lot of the new defensive plans are going to be announced, especially this sort of ambitious desire for expanding the NATO response force. And at the moment, it potentially looks like Finland might be able to get in by Vilnius. And while it's the preference for both Finland, Sweden, and also the US have said that they want to join together, I think if there's an opportunity to get Finland into NATO membership, then that has to be taken, because actually NATO can do a lot of advancements of its plans, especially linking their Nordic and Baltic regional plans together with Finland in the alliance. That's pretty important. And then sort of diplomatically work on the Swedish side again. And Sweden still has security guarantees from a number of states, still a joint expeditionary force member, still a Nordic member. So I think from a security perspective, and it doesn't actually share a land border with Russia. So if there's an opportunity to get Finland into NATO membership, it should be taken.
Okay, I think we just have a couple of minutes. So perhaps I'll just ask the second most, I think, popular question, which I think is actually an important one, which is, this is a question from Chris Brooks, and I think this is really an issue about whether there are risks that we're still looking for kind of the good news on the Ukraine war, that there's a bit of an echo chamber in the West, and that our discussions like today's, are there risks that we're overlooking the possibility that actually Russia could make serious progress in Ukraine? There is a risk that Russia could in some ways be able to claim victory, perhaps in minimum victory, taking the Donbass. So I think this is a question, perhaps I'll begin with Maryna and then go through the rest of the panel. Are there still serious risks around the conflict that Russia could break out and perhaps begin to achieve the goals that President Putin set at the beginning of the war?
Yes, I think this is a very important point to consider, and I would caution against really trying to, artificially look for the good news where we are aware that still a multiplicity of risks are still present. Because I've seen this shift from the thinking, that basically Russia will win in 3 days to a year after, especially after the September efficient, effective Ukraine's counteroffensive, sort of, thinking that we've crossed this Rubicon already. But I don't think so. That and this is part of why Western military support is still very, very important. So kind of to avoid the complacency in thinking that we are past already the worst period, because I don't think so. And this war, as any other war, can have its cycles, with Russia regrouping and then trying to again to restart its offensive. And also, I don't think that this is. I mean, sometimes it's portrayed that protracted conflict or war of attrition is the better news rather than this dramatic escalation. I don't think that this is completely good news, because I mean, this we can agree all that Russia is losing in strategic terms, but in the case if the war of attrition drags on, this would mean that Ukraine will be economically exhausted with the human losses continued. So while we talk that time does not work to Russia's advantage, it doesn't work to Ukraine's advantage either. So, and I think we need to bear this in mind.
Thanks. Emily, where do you see the risks still in the war? And I think going back to Chris's question, are there people in Russia who actually are making sort of rational strategic judgments that Russia does stand a chance of making serious progress in the conflict? Or is this all caught up in this ideology of imperialism?
Yeah, thanks. I'm actually very pleased that we came to Chris's question, because it was one that I was particularly interested to answer. Because I think the question is really, what is important to Russia? What does their version of victory look like? And what does their version of success look like? And I wonder if we're still in that position as we were when the war began, of misreading what Russia's aims are and what is important to the country. So sure, we can talk in terms of military defeats here and there and their lack of preparedness, but I think, Russia does seem to be learning from some of its mistakes, as it has in other conflicts, and it evolves and it's, repositions accordingly, which is why you see its war aims downscaled from overall invasion of Kiev to now more modest parts of the Donbass region. But I think more fundamentally, if this is to be a victory for Russia in any way, it is a victory for Kremlin messaging, because what it has succeeded in doing is making Russia much more isolated and open to alternative perspectives. The control of the information space obviously helps with that. And it has really, I think, removed a lot of the fundamental opposition to Putin. And obviously that's a process that was underway for some time, but I think the war in Ukraine has acted as a catalyst to speed that up. So if there is a victory for anybody from the Russian perspective, I think that, the ideology and the way in which Putin is manufacturing a system is actually reasonably successful. And I think from the Russian perspective, there are plenty of people who do buy into that system, often from a lack of alternatives within Russia or a lack of access to alternative systems outside of Russia. But I think it's pretty important that plenty of people in Russia do think that Russia has a chance at victory, of liberation of parts of the Donbass that they believe to be, controlled by nationalists and far-right elements. And I think that is still a view that is quite prevalent in Russia, and that is very difficult to counter.
And the last word to you, Ed, on this question.
Yeah, I think Emily covered the sort of political dimensions of it very well. So just a couple of points on the military, and also Maryna mentioned it. I mean, I think if Western support is maintained at the current levels, or broadly the current levels, I mean, that is Ukrainian center of gravity at the moment, is Western support. I think Ukraine are in the ascendancy for a variety of reasons that we talked about already in this webinar. So that's sort of why it's not necessarily just looking at good news. I think it's looking at sort of how Ukraine are fighting. The moral component of fighting power is it has been superb, and it's really been the difference between the two. Yes, there is historical precedent of Russia, particularly around the Winter War and then a continuation war quite soon after, where they did adapt. My issue is, a lot of what I'm seeing currently. I mean, if there was one problem with the Russian military at the moment, then I would probably have a slightly different viewpoint. But militaries generally split everything out functionally. So intelligence, operations, logistics, planning, communications. Everything has been poor. So if there's one thing that they could fix, I'd probably think that Russia had more of a chance of achieving military aims. But yeah, I agree with Emily. At the moment, when you look at a map, that really looks like, probably the areas in the Donbass, and really quite small gains for the cost in personnel and equipment that it will take Russia to achieve.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of today's discussion. We've run out of time. But equally unfortunately, it looks like the war is going to continue on for some time. We will continue our leading coverage of the conflict, trying to understand what is happening and where the war is heading. And so I look forward to welcoming you back to future RUSI events. But for now, it's goodbye from me, Neil Melvin at RUSI in London.